Good morning, everyone. It's January 22nd, 2019. Will the globalists sacrifice the dollar to get their new world order? This comes from Brandon Smith from the Alt Market, and it is reposted on shtfplan.com. Now, people keep getting this new world order thing wrong. The new world order is the United States. We are the New World. This is the continent that's been referred to the New World ever since before Columbus. What they're talking about is a one world order. So, and they may, but let's check it out. And by the way, Peter Schiff, the recession is a done deal thanks to the Fed's interest rate hikes. Even though Peter was on TV last year, the year before, talking about how they needed to hike the interest rates, but I digress. And trade is a fundamental element of human survival. No one person can produce every single product or service necessary for a comfortable life, no matter how Spartan their attitude. Unless your goal is to desperately scratch an existence from your local terrain with no chance of progress in the future, you are going to need a network of other producers. For most of the history of human civilization, production was the basis for the economy. All other elements were secondary. At some point, as trade grows and thrives, a society is going to start looking for a store of value, something that represents the man-hours and effort and ingenuity a person put into their day. Something that is universally accepted within barter networks, something highly prized that is tangible, that could be held in our hands and is impossible to replicate artificially. Precious metals. Thus, the concept of money was born, and, for the most part, it functioned quite well for thousands of years. Unfortunately, there were people in our world that see economy as a tool for control rather than a vital process that should be left alone to develop naturally. The idea of fiat money, money which has no tangibility, and that can be created on a whim by a central source or authority, is rather new in the grand scheme of things. It is the bastardization of the original and much more stable money system that existed before that was anchored in hard commodities. While it claims to offer a more liquid store of value, the truth is that there is no store of value at all. Purveyors of fiat central banks and globalists use ever-increasing debt as a means to feed fiat, not to mention the hidden tax of price inflation. When central bankers get a hold of money, it is no longer a representation of work or value, but a system of enslavement that crushes our ability to produce effectively and to receive our fair return for our labor. There are many people today in the liberty movement that understand this dynamic, but even in alternative economic circles, there are some that do not understand the full picture when it comes to central banks and fiat mechanisms. There's a false notion that paper currencies are the lifeblood of the establishment and that they will seek to protect these currencies at all cost. This might have been true 20 years ago or more, but it's not true today. Shit changes. The king of this delusion is the U.S. dollar. As the world reserve currency, it is thought by some to be untouchable, a pillar of the globalist structure that will be defended for many decades to come. The reality, however, is that the dollar is more than another con game, or is nothing more than another con game to the globalists, a farce that they are happy to sacrifice in order to further their goal of complete centralization of world trade and therefore the complete centralization of control over human survival. That is to say, the dollar is a stepping stone for them and nothing more. The real goal of the globalist is an economic system in which they can monitor every transaction, no matter how small. A system in which there is eventually only one currency, a currency that can be tracked, granted or taken away at a moment's notice. Let me see. Imagine a world in which your store of value is subject to constant bureaucratic monstrosity, and there is no way to hide from them by using private trade as a backstop. Imagine a world in which you cannot hold your money in your hand and access to your money can be denied with the push of a button if you step out of line. That is what the globalists really desire. You might recall that interview with Aaron Russo, where he was friends with, what Rockefeller was that? I don't suppose it's important which one, but you remember he quoted this Rockefeller as saying, they want people to be chipped, that way they can turn it off if, and I'm paraphrasing, if they don't like what you're doing. Some people might claim that this kind of system already exists, but they would be fooling themselves. Even though fiat currency like the dollar are a cancer on free markets and true production, they still offer privacy to a point, and they can still be physically allocated and held in your hand, making them harder to confiscate. The globalists want to take a bad thing and make it even worse. So the question arises, how do they plan to make the shift from the current fiat paper system to their one world order economy? First and foremost, they will seek a controlled demolition of the dollar as the world reserve currency. You know, just like they had a controlled demolition of all three World Trade Center buildings. They have accomplished this in the past with other reserve currencies, such as the pound sterling, which was carefully diminished over a period of 2 decades, just after World War II, through the use of treasury bond dogs by France and the U.S., as well as the forced removal of the sterling as the petrol currency. This was done to make way for the U.S. dollar as a replacement after the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. The dollar did not achieve true world reserve status, though, until after the gold standard was completely abandoned by Nixon in the early 70s, at which point a deal was struck with the Saudi Arabia, making the dollar the petrol currency. Once the dollar was no longer anchored to gold, the world's energy market was made dependent on it. The fate of the U.S. economy was sealed. Unlike Britain and the sterling, the U.S. economy is hyper-dependent on the dollar's world reserve status. While Britain suffered declining conditions for decades after the loss, including inflation, and high interest rates, the U.S. will experience far more acute pain. A complete lack of adequate manufacturing capability within U.S. borders has turned our nation into a consumer-based society rather than a society of producers, meaning we are dependent on the demand for our currency as a reserve in order to enjoy affordable goods from outside sources. Add to this lack of production ability to add to this lack of production ability the fact that for the past decade, the Federal Reserve has been pumping trillions of dollars into financial markets around the globe. This means trillions of dollars held overseas only on the promise that those dollars will be accepted by major exporters as a universal store of value. If faith in that promise is lost, which more and more it is, those trillions could come flooding back into the U.S. through various channels, and the buying power of the currency would crumble. There is a delusion within the American mainstream that even if such an event were to occur, the transition could be handled with ease. And that's fantastical, I know, but never underestimate the cognitive dissonance of people blinded by bias. The rebuilding of a production base within the U.S. to offset the crisis of losing the world reserve currency would take many years, perhaps decades. And this is in the best case scenario. With a plummeting currency and extreme price inflation, the cost of establishing new production on large scale would be immense. While local labor might become cheap, all other elements of the economy would become very, very expensive. And by the way, you can see this reflected in your grocery bill. I went from being able to feed a family of 4 for 2 weeks with $100. Now it's more like $130. In the worst case scenario, there would be complete societal breakdown, likely followed by an attempted totalitarian response by government. In which case, forget any domestically funded economic recovery. Any further recovery would have to be funded and managed from outside the U.S. And here is where we see the globalist plan taking shape. The banking elites have hinted in the past how they might try to reset the global economy. And it's not just a reset of the global economy, it's a population reset as well. As I've mentioned in many articles, the globalist-run magazine The Economist in 1988 discussed the removal of the dollar to make way for a global currency, a currency which would be introduced to the masses by 2018. Of course, this did not happen. This introduction did in fact take place. I disagree, maybe with blockchain, but that's not the actual currency. Right? They introduced the means, but not the currency itself. But this introduction did in fact take place as the Economist declared it would. Blockchain and digital currency systems, the intended foundation of the next globalist monetary structure, received unprecedented coverage the past 2 years. They are now part of the public consciousness. Here's how, I believe it was Brandon, right? Yeah, Brandon Smith. So this is how he believes the process will. This conjured an even bigger bubble, which many alternative analysts have dubbed the everything bubble. The growing everything bubble encompasses not just stock markets or housing, but auto markets, credit markets, bond markets, and the dollar itself. All of these elements are now tied directly to Fed policy. The U.S. economy is not only addicted to stimulus measures and near-zero interest rates, it will die without them. The Fed knows this well. Chairman Jerome Powell hinted at the crisis that would evolve if the Fed ever cut off stimulus, unwound its balance sheet, and hiked rates in October of 2012 Fed minutes. And of course, he did exactly what he said would create the crisis, or would evolve the crisis. Without constant and ever-expanding stimulus measures, the false economy will implode. We're already seeing the effects as the Fed cuts tens of billions per month in assets from its balance sheets and hikes interest rates to their neutral rate of inflation. Auto markets, house markets, and credit markets are in reversal, and stocks are witnessing the most instability since the 2008 crash. All of this was triggered by the Fed simply exerting incremental rate hikes and balance sheet cuts. It is also important to note that almost every U.S. stock market rally in the past several months has taken place while the Fed's balance sheet cuts were frozen. For example, for the past 2.5 weeks, the Fed's assets have only dropped by around $8 billion. This is basically a flat line in the balance sheet. It should not be surprising, given this pause in cuts, that stocks spiked through early to mid-January. That said, Fed tightening will start again, either by rate hikes, asset cuts, or both at the same time. The Fed's purpose is to create a crisis. The Fed's goal is to cause a crash. The Fed is a suicide bomber that does not care what happens to the United States system. But what about the dollar specifically? The Fed's tightening policies do not only translate to crisis for U.S. stocks or other markets. I see three primary ways in which the dollar can be dethroned as the world reserve currency. Number one, emerging economies have become addicted to Fed liquidity over the past 10 years. Without continued access to the Fed's easy money, nations like China and India are beginning to seek out alternatives to the dollar as a world reserve. Contrary to the popular belief that these countries would never be able to decouple from the U.S., the process has already begun. And it is the Fed that has actually created the necessity for emerging markets to seek out other sources of liquidity besides the U.S. dollar. Number two, Donald Trump's trade war is yet another cover event for the loss of reserve status. I would note that the primary rationale for tariffs was to balance the trade deficit. The trade deficit with China has done the opposite and is continually expanding each month. This suggests much higher tariffs on China would be required to reduce the imbalance. And this is listed as one of Trump's accomplishments. It also must be understood that the trade deficit with China has long been part of a larger agreement. China is one of the largest buyers of U.S. debt in the world and has continued to utilize the dollar as the world reserve currency. If the trade war continues through this year, it is only a matter of time before China, already seeking dollar alternatives as the Fed tightens liquidity, will start using its U.S. Treasuries and dollar holdings as leverage against us. Bilateral agreements between multiple nations that cut the dollar are being established regularly. If China, the largest exporter/importer in the world, stops accepting the dollar as the world reserve, or if they start accepting other currencies in competition, then numerous other nations will follow their lead. And number 3. Finally, if the war of words between Trump and the Fed becomes something more, then this could be used by the establishment to undermine faith in U.S. credit. If Trump seeks to shut down the Fed entirely, the globalists are handed yet another perfect distraction for the death of the dollar. I can see the headlines now. The reset could then be painted as a rescue of the global economy after the destructive actions of populists who bumbled into fiscal destruction because they were blinded by an obsession with sovereignty in a world that requires centralization to survive. So they believe that the world requires centralization for humanity to survive, but really the world requires sovereignty in order to survive. I will leave the link for the rest of the article, it's rather long, in the description box, along with my Discord server link. If you agreed with what was said, please give me a thumbs up. A share PayPal link in the description box as well. Kill the state. Live free.